Guards on the decks leaned against conning towers or 88mm deck guns, submachine guns hanging casually from their necks. They watched us critically and seemed amused as we paraded down the planks. We reached the end of the jetty where two ships were tied to either side of the wooden pier. An old steamer of about 10,000 tons rested at the north side, while at the south side the tender Lech, the command ship of the flotilla, was tied up. We presented our papers to another guard, then crossed the gangway to the Lech and piled our suitcases alongside her starboard railing. As we searched for the officer's wardroom, the scent of freshly brewed coffee lured us to the mess hall. We received an excellent breakfast and soon felt reborn in our new environment. The room gradually filled with officers of all ranks. They wore snow-white jackets and looked relaxed and content. Evidently they had found an ideal Navy life here as they worked and slept on a ship, saw water all day long, but were never far from the city and its nightlife. Around 0800 we prepared ourselves to report to the commander of the 5th U-boat flotilla. His adjutant, a young and arrogant lieutenant, made us wait for more than an hour before he let us know that the commander would not be available. Freed to do as we pleased, we left the tender to acquaint ourselves with the U-boats and their crews.
What are your orders, Captain?
We learned that some of the boats had just returned from a patrol while others had completed their training in the Baltic and were about to be fitted out for their first mission. Large quantities of cans, boxes, and fresh foodstuffs were carted onto the pier by trucks and piled up alongside the boats. Shortly before noon, we met again in the Lech's wardroom in expectation of lunch. Small standing parties discussed the latest special bulletin which had been broadcast minutes before. U-boats had attacked a British convoy in the North Atlantic and had destroyed, so far, 8 ships totaling over 50,000 tons. It was the greatest success recorded on a single convoy operation, and with the U-boats still in pursuit of the enemy, more sinkings could be expected. A feeling of pride took possession of us, although we were not yet a part of the U-boat force. Enthusiasm was high when the CO stepped into the wardroom. He went to his traditional chair, waited until all of us had found a place to sit, and then addressed the assembly. Gentlemen, we have received numerous radiograms from our U-boat captains, who are presently chasing a British convoy across the Atlantic. According to their reports, the number of ships sunk has reached 14, with a total of approximately 85,000 tons destroyed. One escort vessel has been torpedoed. This is by far our most rewarding hunt. The battle in the Atlantic has become our battle. Our U-boats are dictating the terms.
Set a course to these coordinates.
We toasted the success, then sat down for dinner where the news was the main topic of discussion. With a steadily increasing number of U-boats cruising the seas, the toll on British shipping was reaching unprecedented levels. Indeed, we had reason to believe that our blockade against England would soon result in her downfall. On land, our armies had driven deep into enemy territory. Following our conquest of Poland, Norway had been defeated almost overnight. Holland, Belgium and France were overrun within a few weeks, and Denmark had been occupied. Our capital ships controlled the European waters far into the Arctic region. It seemed to me one thing remained to be done: intensify the U-boat offensive against England, starve the British and force them to surrender. Once we held the British Isles, the war would end. After lunch we newcomers congregated on deck to await orders. Finally, at 14:30, the adjutant passed our crowd waving a few white pieces of paper. We followed him into the officers' mess and formed a circle around him, drawing nervously on our cigarettes while he sorted his sheets. At last the adjutant began to speak. He called our names in alphabetical order, specified our boats and the port where each one was to be boarded. Since my name was at the end of the list, my patience was put to a severe test. Some of us were lucky and were assigned to a boat moored at this very pier. Others had to travel to faraway ports. The adjutant concluded by saying,
Check your text messages, woman.
those who have to report to Bremerhaven,
That's delicious, baby.
Danzig, or Königsberg must leave with the next
I'm
train.
getting mom.
There is no time for a long goodbye with your sweethearts, gentlemen. Ensign Warner stays aboard the Lech for a special assignment. I was stunned. Hopeful that this was all a mistake, I approached the young adjutant and asked why I had been left stranded aboard the Lech. Don't you worry, he
Alright.
said disdainfully. You will get to the front fast enough. Your boat, U551, is still on mission. You have to wait until she returns. When will that be, sir? I can't tell exactly. But if it makes you feel better, I've heard the boat has radioed that she has aborted her patrol. I was relieved to hear that I was to join an experienced crew, but I was a disappointed and envious ensign when I shook hands with my departing classmates. Later that afternoon I was told to hold myself at the adjutant's disposal. My main duty was to take officers aboard motor launches and shuttle them across the bay to Kiel and the shipyards. I had expected huge responsibilities. Instead I was asked to perform something that any petty officer could have done as well. I tried in vain to convince the adjutant that I had never handled a small craft. We shall see, he said, taking me aboard one of the launches. If you haven't done it before, you will learn. Despite my best efforts to do the job poorly, the adjutant seemed satisfied. To my displeasure, I suddenly found myself in charge of all the motorboats. Several days passed and U551 had not returned from patrol. From time to time I went to see the communication officer.
Yo, what's going on out there? We got somebody here in the stream. Holler at me in chat. We're listening to Iron Coffins here while we're getting ready to sail out of port and go blow some shit up, so thanks for joining us.
She had been lost in the North Atlantic. I expected to be transferred aboard another U-boat immediately, but when nothing happened after several more days, I became uneasy. I suspected that the adjutant had intentionally neglected to arrange a new assignment. One day at breakfast I arranged to sit next to the flotilla's chief engineer, whom I had regarded as an
I need a doctor.
I discreetly explained my situation. The chief promised to do something on my behalf. Though I was not quite sure he had made the promise in earnest, results came immediately. The next afternoon I was told to see the adjutant. Stern-faced, he handed me a sheet of paper. I realized instantly that it was my new order. I clicked my heels in sudden joy, saluted, and left his office quickly. Outside, I read the order in detail. I was to report aboard U557 in Königsberg. I was ecstatic.
We're gonna try this configuration. I don't know. We'll see.
Girlfriend Marianne in Berlin. I had not seen her since the previous December and a reunion was long overdue. As usual, we planned to meet in a small cafe near the Scala Theater. I knew Marianne was as reliable as she was beautiful, and she was just 5 minutes late, quite remarkable for such a pretty woman. Her face and blue eyes glowed as they had when I had first met her before the war on Lake Constance. We sat and talked happily for a few minutes, and when we left the cafe there was the unspoken agreement between us that we would not separate that night. After spending the afternoon together walking through Berlin, we had assumed finding a small hotel or bed and breakfast would be easy. But we rang dozens of bells and no door opened for us. We walked up and down for almost an hour before we found a little place and a tiny room to stay in.
Excuse me.
Two of us, as we did not require much space to be content.
T5,
Long
T3,
after midnight,
T3.
the air raid sirens began to blare. I had forgotten that there was a war
T3
on and that the
fat.
planes occasionally slipped through our air defense. After some
More
hesitation,
T3
we
fat.
decided to remain where we were and not seek shelter. While the flak hammered sporadically, we heard the howling of falling bombs accompanied by muffled explosions. The building vibrated slightly. When the raid was finally over, we had learned that defiance sometimes can be sweet. The next morning, the world looked as peaceful as always on this day of April 1941. Stores, cafes and hotels were doing business as usual. When the church bells rang the hour, it was like any sunny Sunday before the war. Time to say goodbye always comes too early.
Alright,
Especially when
and
oneself stays in a shared
we are
hotel room
loading
with a girl.
some
That
ammo.
day I was not quite sure whether I would have preferred a further departure.
Thanks for
Although I
joining
felt
us in
quite
the stream.
comfortable
Appreciate you
in
hitting
the
that
lots of
like
Navy,
button
I
out there.
regarded
Thank you
my
so
love for the
much.
Navy as being of a more permanent
Hero.
nature. It was still quite
We're gonna
early
grab
when
a
we kissed
few more of the
goodbye,
higher
especially we
quality
promised to see
torpedoes,
each
and then
other
we're
again
gonna
as soon as the
head
war wore
on
off.
out. One
I
more.
arrived in Königsberg at dusk.
There we go.
I was astonished to see the station fully illuminated, as if in peacetime. Streetlights, neon signs, storefronts and windows were ablaze with light. Despite the vague directions given to me by a policeman, I found the Navy Yard where I was to board U557. Several U-boats swayed alongside a granite jetty, and for a moment I paused at the pier and stared at the black dagger-shaped machines in the murky waters, wondering which one would carry me into battle against England. Some distance away lay an ocean liner. It was painted blindingly white and lit up like a Christmas tree. Assuming that the white ship was the flotilla's headquarters, I dragged my baggage across the gangway and reported to the officer of the watch. He referred me to the mate on duty, and the mate sent me to the purser, who in turn arranged for a cabin. I eventually fell into a soft reclining chair, hungry and exhausted. At last, I had arrived. It was very late when
And we're cruising along. We're just leaving port, listening to Iron Coffins here. The story of Herbert Werner, Submarine Capitan. Awesome story. I've listened to this already from start to finish. It's an amazing story.
They spun around. Chubby-faced Google replied, "It's none of your business, you landlubber. We just came back from a long training cruise." Gerloff, tall and blonde, added smilingly, "You see the salt crusts on our lips? They don't dissolve in water, so we have to use alcohol. That's how long we've been at sea." "I'll match that soon," I countered. "Not if they keep you in port to run their motorboats," snapped Google. U-557. "Do you fellows know where I can find her?" "She happens to be ours," Gerloff said, "and the captain will have a stroke when he hears that you'll be joining." The talkative pair began to tell of their first experience aboard a U-boat. Their enthusiasm for the weapon system, as well as the captain and the crew, seemed sincere and not the result of increased consumption of alcohol. I forgot my hunger and listened carefully, washing down their tales with a few more drinks than I was accustomed to. It was past midnight when I finally lay my spinning head on a pillow. The next morning at 0800, I boarded U-557 to report for duty. The boat was weather-beaten. The conning tower looked like a surrealistic painting, and the protective red undercoat showed in streaks through the splintered gray surface paint. Rust had formed everywhere, even around the barrel of the heavily greased 8.8-centimeter deck gun. There was a light green shine of algae on the wooden deck that covered the steel hull.
Hard mateys, more slaves for the gulags.
I found it very appealing.
Hell
I
yeah.
presented my transfer orders to the captain and said, "Herr Oberleutnant, I beg to report aboard." He glanced at the paper, then shouted, "What the hell is wrong with headquarters? Sending me another ensign? They've already punished me with two just like you. Damned beginners who haven't smelled real U-boat stink." Then, with a vivid sigh, he expressed the hope that I might be useful as extra ballast. I was disappointed by my welcome, but not by the captain. Oberleutnant Ottokar Paulsen was a short, stocky man in his early 30s. He had blonde hair and bright blue eyes that sparkled under the peak of his white navy cap. The white cap, which only the commander had the right to wear aboard, showed traces of patina on its brass ornaments. He wore a long jacket of light gray leather, and it seemed that the shoulders and pockets had been expertly hand-stitched with a heavy yarn. An ornate seaman's braid was fastened at his left epaulette with thread bleached almost white. His feet, cased in large leather boots, stuck out beneath his wrinkled pants. In short, Paulsen fitted my picture of the ideal U-boat commander. With no regard for formalities, the captain bluntly ordered me to change out of my dress uniform, then turned me over to his second officer. This slim and wiry man, possibly 2 years my senior, introduced himself as Lieutenant Seibold, second watch and radio officer. We shook hands heartily. Seibold answered many of my questions before I asked them. He told me that U-557 had just completed a strenuous 7-month shakedown cruise in the Baltic. The boat's company totaled 48 men, not counting us ensigns. It consisted of 4 officers, 3 warrant officers, 14 petty officers and 27 seamen, machinists and technicians. Some of the men had already seen action, and with them as a core unit, Paulsen had forged boat and crew into an effective combat machine, ready and eager for the gruesome work that lay ahead. Paulsen himself, Seibold continued proudly, was a veteran of the Underseas Force. He had served aboard a U-boat in 1937 during the Spanish Civil War, cruising the Mediterranean and the Bay of Biscay. Later, Paulsen trained many of the crews now manning U-boats in the North Atlantic. At the end of this little history lesson, Seibold ordered the first seaman's mate to take care of my immediate needs. The mate led me back to the ocean liner. There, I was equipped with 3 sets of fatigues, a full leather overall, an oilskin outfit for bad weather, 2 blue sweaters, blue knitted underwear, rubber boots, felt-lined leather boots, thick gloves, binoculars, and a multitude of small items. To secure all this gear I had to make no less than 3 trips from the supply room to my cabin in the liner. I was putting on my fresh fatigues when Google rushed into my cabin, almost smashing the door off its hinges. "Hey sailor, pack your bags. We are sailing at 1400, destination Kiel." "Damn it," I snarled, "that's where I just came from." I packed in a hurry, carried all my belongings aboard U-557, and threw them into one of the narrow berths. At exactly 1400 hours, U-557 separated from the pier. The boat slid away in complete silence, powered by electric motors. She maneuvered into navigable waters, then her diesels took over. U-557 headed for the open sea. Welcome to Trench Diaries. Iron Coffins, Part 3. When the silhouette of Königsberg had sunk below the horizon, the captain ordered the third seaman's watch to the bridge. After leaving port, I had remained on the bridge to take in the moment. The boat followed a westward course as hard short breakers hit her from starboard and a fine water spray showered the superstructure. I went down the ladder into the long narrow boat where everything was peaceful. Each man had taken his proper station. The only sound I heard in the forward compartments was the rumbling of the diesel engines. Oberleutnant Kern, the executive officer, approached me in the center aisle and gave me an order regarding my immediate duties. I was to be a lookout with the second seaman's watch when the boat was surfaced. When it was submerged I would do various jobs, like assisting at the helm or hydroplane station. I was to help Wiesner, the navigator, calculate our position and help Second Officer Seibold decode top-secret messages with the Enigma machine. I was also to spend time with Kern as well as Fetter, the chief engineer. Both would familiarize me with the boat's design, machinery, equipment, ballast tanks, valves, torpedoes and TDC, as well as the deck artillery armament. Kern urged me to spend my spare time studying the engineering manuals, so that I would catch up with the rest of the crew as quickly as possible. He then took me on a tour through the pressure hull. The trip soon turned into a sobering experience, because after a few steps I lost my bearings completely. I banged my head against pipes and ducts, against hand wheels and instruments, against the low round hatches in the bulkheads that separated the compartments. It was like crawling through a bottleneck. Most annoying of all, the boat rocked vigorously in the increasingly rough seas. In order to keep my balance, I frequently had to reach for grip as I staggered over the floor plates like a drunk. Apparently I would have to duck my head, walk softly, and ride with the waves or I would not survive a single day in this metal tube. As we passed through the control room I ducked under the extension of the conning tower. Then, without warning, a heavy breaker came rushing down the hatch, drenching me to the skin. The old veterans laughed loud. The XO,
Arrgh. We got another Tommy, lads.
The boat was divided into 4 pressurized compartments. The aft section contained all the machinery and electrical equipment, the air compressor, and 1 torpedo tube. The 2 powerful diesel engines were capable of pushing the boat to 19 knots on the surface. 2 electric motors, operating on gigantic storage batteries, ran the boat when it was submerged. They could propel the boat for 1 hour at the top speed of 9 knots or for 3 days at a cruising speed of 1 or 2 knots. However, these batteries had to be recharged every 24 hours under normal conditions. This could only be done on the surface because the batteries that ran the electric motors were charged by generators driven by the diesel engines. Between the diesel compartment and midships were a tiny galley, a washroom, the petty officer's quarters. Below all of this, 1/2 of the 50-ton batteries resided. In the compartment amidships was the heart and brain of the boat, the control room. It was crowded with pipes, ducts, valves, wires, hand wheels,
All engines
gauges,
stop.
switches, meters, control mechanisms, and a gyro compass. There were also pumps, a freshwater generator, the observation periscope, magnetic compass, chart closet and table, as well as electrical gear to control the rudder and hydroplanes. The forward section contained the radio room, the hydrophone station, bow torpedo compartment with 4 tubes and also seamen's quarters, officers and warrant officers' wardrooms, the captain's small cabin, a hint of a washroom, and again below deck plates, the second half of the batteries. The pressurized compartments were subdivided into 7 watertight rooms, each equipped with watertight doors that could withstand water pressure at a depth of 120 meters. The smallest compartment, the conning tower, contained the attack periscope and the TDC. Ballast tanks, trim tanks, fuel oil and freshwater tanks were located throughout the boat, as well as the outboard saddle tanks. After walking the full length of the boat, I was overwhelmed by her complexity and thoroughly confused by the XO's rather superficial descriptions. I believed that it would take me years to gain the knowledge and skill to receive the captain's qualification. I was at the navigator's small plotting table when the captain called from the bridge, "Rig for dive, exercise alarm." Moments later, the men on watch came tumbling down the ladder, hitting the deck plates with violent impacts. Then the alarm bell shrieked throughout the boat. To open up the main ballast tanks to the sea, machinists grabbed overhead valve handles and hung from them, using the full weight of their bodies to speed the opening action. Others turned hand wheels frantically. With a loud roar, air escaped the tanks and water rushed in. U-557 dove so swiftly that I had to grab something to stop myself from falling on the metal deck plates. Again I was reminded that I had to remain constantly alert. Suddenly there was a scream, urgent and piercing. Outboard air induction valve doesn't close. U-557 sank fast, bow first, at an angle of 35 degrees. A machinist appeared in the round opening of the rear bulkhead and yelled, "We can't stop the leak. Main valve probably jammed." Paulson shouted, "Blow all tanks, full rise on the planes, to the surface, Chief." But it was in vain. Within seconds the depth gauge went to 60 meters, then 70, 85, then 110 meters. Then the boat briefly balanced out on an even keel and suddenly began to tilt down at the stern. I was thrown aft until I grabbed an overhead pipe. Now the boat continued its rapid descent toward the bottom of the Baltic, but this time stern first. Her descent was so steep that everything not secured, like suitcases, boxes, food cans and personal belongings, tumbled down the center aisle. The 2 men who operated the hydroplane slid from their seats into the central valve station. One man was flung through the round hatch in the forward bulkhead and clung to it in desperation. The chief yelled, "Stop, emergency blow. The boat is out of control." At this point I was puzzled as to why he would do this. I later realized that he wanted to preserve some pressurized air. As U-557 neared the ocean floor, a terrifying roar came from the diesel compartment. Tons of water rushed through an apparent leak. Then the boat hit with a shuddering jolt and the lights went out. I lost my grip and landed on top of the navigator, who himself had fallen over someone else. Then, there was silence. A low voice came up from the aft section, "Inboard air induction valve is closed and secured." The leak had been stopped. But the boat, with her stern buried in the mud, hung at a 50-degree angle, swinging back and forth gently like a pendulum. "Engage auxiliary lighting, all men to the bow room." This was the captain's voice, stoic and encouraging. At once the lights came on and shadowy figures began the climb uphill towards the bow. I noted that the depth gauge was reading 142 meters. U-557 seemed to be stuck solidly in the mud. Her electrical circuits were out of order and the batteries had lost much of their acid. Poisonous chlorine fumes were escaping, which meant there was the added possibility of an explosion. My thoughts were interrupted by someone shouting through the speaking tube, "This is the diesel room. Mechanic Eckstein is dead." It flashed through my mind that Eckstein might have gotten lucky. If the deadly gases did not burn away our lungs, we would die of suffocation as our oxygen supply was used up. We continued struggling uphill on hands and knees, bracing our feet against the hull and equipment. As I dragged myself along the deck plates, I looked into the faces of men I hardly knew. Soaking wet, smeared with oil and grease, dirty and sweating, they followed Paulson's order without showing any emotion. We had all become important ballast, putting our weight on the scale of our collective fates. It was indeed ironic that the captain had called me surplus ballast when I reported aboard. Eventually, the men reached the forward torpedo room. But the bow of the boat lowered only slightly. She seemed to be locked in her position, the tremendous weight in the aft bilges acting as an anchor. I heard the captain conferring with the chief engineer in the control room. Paulson ordered 25 men to form a bucket line to move the water from the flooded engine rooms into the bilge of the bow compartment, thus equalizing the weight and putting the boat on an even keel. I joined the group and descended the steep grade, sliding on my ass along the floor plate through the aisle. Arriving in the
sliding on his
I
ass.
saw dark oily water covering most of the compartment. Out of reach, caught in the controls of the aft torpedo tube, hung the dead mechanic. His head was split open at the right temple and blood streaked his face. The pool of black liquid seemed too wide and deep to move with buckets and cans, and I calculated that our efforts to get the water to the bow would serve only to use up our oxygen at a much faster rate. Nevertheless, we started with this arduous task. We worked in near silence, passing the full buckets from man to man up the elongated tomb, spilling the oily salty substance over ourselves. Unable to hold any position for long, we skidded over the plates while trying to hand the full buckets uphill. Sometimes an empty metal can came flying past our heads like a projectile. Some men groaned under the load. Others uttered curses when the grimy water was spilled into their faces. This went on for 3 hours. We counted the buckets and cans in agony, 420, 421, 22, and so on. Another hour. With enormous effort we fought against fatigue and resignation, yet the water level in the stern had fallen only a little. But the containers passed from hand to hand in an unbroken chain, 582, 83. After we had put in 6 hours of hard labor, the second half of the crew took their turn. The air had thick and it stank of oil.
Just gonna sit back and watch my handiwork right now.
Our breath grew short, our movements weak. And still we continued to pass the containers in agonizing sluggishness. Now everyone was half suffocated, half drowned. At this point we had been submerged for over 14 hours. Then Paulson made a new attempt at survival. Gasping for air, we struggled uphill toward the tip of the boat. As I forced myself in between the torpedo tubes, the impossible occurred. Very slowly and gently, the hull began to sway. Air bubbles suddenly escaped the forward ballast tanks with a guttural noise. Then the bow descended and hit the bottom with a thud. Encouraged by hope, the men drove themselves into action. The dead mechanic was carried to the captain's cabin and covered with canvas. The captain closed the green curtain, thus separating the dead man from the rest of the crew. The bilge pumps were disabled, so again the excess water in the aft bilges had to be moved with buckets to balance the boat. Meanwhile, the cook handed out cans of peaches, pears, and strawberries. Spirits rose as hunger and thirst were quenched. But the fact remained that we were trapped on the bottom of the bulkhead. Some 40 tons of water pressed the boat to the bottom. The chief went to work to free us of this predicament. At his command, compressed air shot into the ballast tanks with a hissing sound, but the boat remained glued to the bottom. More air rushed into the tanks, but still nothing happened. Then the stream of air diminished and finally stopped. We had exhausted our compressed air supply, which meant we were still doomed. But the chief did not give up. He yelled, "All men to the bow." Everybody pushed and stumbled forward. As we crowded into the forward compartment, the chief ordered us to turn around and run aft. We tumbled and tripped in the opposite direction, ducking through the hatches in the bulkheads, slipping and sliding along the wet deck plates. Arriving in the aft compartment, we heard the chief calling us back, and again we turned around and started forward blindly, like mad steers in a stampede. We gasped and coughed and ran and ran. Almost imperceptibly, the boat began stirring. Then, as we poured into the bow torpedo room, the stern suddenly lifted. U-557 had rocked herself free. The men ran to their stations. Unbelievably, the bow lifted and the boat floated gently upwards in complete freedom. As I stepped into the control room, the needle of the depth gauge had already passed 140 meters. It swung to 130 meters and moved steadily along the dial. Excitedly the chief reported the depth to the captain in the conning tower, 80 meters. 40 meters. 20 meters. Tower broaching. Boat has surfaced. Paulson flipped open the bridge hatch, ending 20 hours in our underwater tune. Fresh crystal clear air streamed through the hull, reviving every man, but one. U-557 resumed her voyage to keel on the surface where calm routine replaced the hectic ordeal. An inspection soon disclosed that a wrench was jammed in the outboard air induction valve just below the weather deck. No one knew how it had gotten there.
What was on that ship, huh?
Welcome to Trench Diaries.
Report sent.
Iron Coffins. Part 4.
Change course. Torpedo and tube 4.
During the next 2 days and nights, I adjusted gradually to my new way of life.
Report sent.
I became acquainted with most of the crew, made myself useful wherever possible and took my place on the second watch every 8 hours. I learned how to ride with the boat's movement, how to climb up and down the aluminum ladder in the conning tower without injury, how to keep my balance while staggering through the center aisle in heavy seas, how to duck through the circular bulkheads, how to eat my meals between the extremes of the boat's motions, how to use the pump in the washroom by operating its various valves in proper sequence. I also learned that the captain's harshness was only a shell around a very personable character. He was married and had a baby son. Also, to our mutual surprise, we had practically grown up together. We had attended the same high school and studied with the same professors, had drunk from the same water fountain in the courtyard and learned to love the sea while sailing on Lake Constance. These discoveries, however, did not change Paulson's attitude toward me. On the contrary, I felt that this made my training even more rigorous. While my two classmates, Gerloff and Goebel, escaped his constant observation, he developed the strange habit of catching me in my narrow bunk after an exhausting day and sending me back to work in the engine compartment instead of allowing me to rest. Nonetheless, I managed to stay awake on duty. On the 5th day of our near-fatal trip, we approached Kiel at around 0700. We sailed past the Navy's War Memorial, which pointed like an admonishing finger into the morning sky. The Bay of Kiel opened beneath the rising mist, and the boat maneuvered cautiously through the mounting traffic toward the naval base. At 10:30 on April 26th, U-557 finally came to rest at the pier. Our rusty boat berthed near the stern of the tender ledge. The lines were not yet fully secured when Kern, the XO, crossed to the liner to arrange for the crew's lodging and for Eckstein's last journey to his hometown. For the next 2 hours every hand was kept busy transporting damaged suitcases, soaked sea bags and trunks from the U-boat to the steamer. The ship's comfortable cabins contrasted sharply with our tight quarters aboard U-557. I established myself in a third-class cabin, then returned to my boat, which was being stripped down for repairs and a new fitting out. 7 months of rough training, climaxed by our recent damages, had left deep scars throughout the boat. But the men had already forgotten their brush with death. They were relaxed and cheerful as they worked, while a radio blared out the latest popular tunes. I was in the petty officer's wardroom when Gerloff came rushing down the aisle asking, "Have you heard the bad news?" "Haven't heard anything," I said. "What are you talking about?" He replied, "Kretschmer and Shupka are presumed sunk." I can't believe it. But the news was confirmed by Lieutenant Seibold. U-99, with Kretschmer in command, and U-100 under Captain Shupka, had indeed been destroyed while attacking a convoy in the North Atlantic. Both legendary captains had been considered indestructible, and their loss, which was the first to be admitted publicly in 18 months of U-boat action, reminded us that the war at sea was increasing in intensity as the British built up their defenses. Kretschmer, the tonnage king, had sunk close to 325,000 tons of enemy shipping, including 3 destroyers. This was equal to the entire tonnage of a medium-sized seafaring nation. Shupka, with more than 250,000 tons to his credit, was killed when his boat was rammed by the destroyer that had forced him to the surface. Kretschmer, on the other hand, was captured and spent the rest of the war as POW in Canada. The double tragedy, which had occurred on March 17th, stunned and baffled the country. Had the British introduced new weapons or techniques of submarine warfare? So far, hunting surface vessels had been relatively easy. U-boats were fast and maneuverable on as well as beneath the surface and were also capable of diving below the maximum usable depth of British depth charges. Our losses were negligible compared with the casualties U-boats had inflicted upon our adversaries. We had no explanation. Supreme Headquarters, to soften the bad news, issued a statement declaring that U-boats had since the outbreak of war sunk well over
one torpedo left on board.
as well as one battleship.
Let's get out of here.
18 smaller vessels of the Royal Navy. It didn't cheer us up much. U-557 was taken to the shipyard for complete overhaul, including the batteries and all engines and motors. For 1 week the crew shuttled daily between the pier and dry dock. For me, new experiences followed in rapid succession. The first day I was sent to the Admiralty to complete our navigational files with charts of the Atlantic. The second day I helped the XO inventory and complete our library of artillery and torpedo manuals. On the third day, Seibold made use of my modest administrative skills and my ability to adequately use a typewriter. The chief engineer made me cross-check lists of all government-issued property that had to be accounted for. Tools, spare parts, seamen's gear, even jars of medicine. The officers displayed a tendency to unload their work on us ensigns, and the nights as well as the days were filled with tedious chores. Finally the weekend brought relief. On Saturday, I drove into Kiel with Goebel and Gerloff and we browsed through the bookstores looking for reading